Well, the high holidays 2023. Rosh Hashanah, September 15th through 17th. It's one day in the Bible, 2 days in Jewish custom,
You say
and I'll
December?
explain that. No, I said September, didn't I?
Oh, September. Maybe I missed it.
Yeah. Yom Kippur, September 24th and 25th. First night of Sukkot, September 29th. Sukkot ends October 6th. Shmini Atzeret, October 7th.
What's
Is-
that?
Well, Sukkot is 7. In the Bible it says 7 days, and then it says on the 8th day. How do you know, that's what the Bible says. It's confusing at first. But anyway, it's the 8th day. Simchat Torah, which is not all in the Bible, but it's Jewish custom, starts October 8th. And I'll explain some of this.
Okay.
Actually, a lot of this is based on, these are neat. I got these from Amazon. Christ and the Passover, okay? That is by, I think that one's by Moshe Rosen. Yes, Seal and Moshe Rosen. They start Jews for Jesus. Okay? These are the 3, out of the 7 feasts in the Bible, these are the 3 pilgrim feasts when all the males were supposed to appear in Jerusalem. The second one is Christ and the Feast of Pentecost, David Brickner and Rick Robinson. Brickner, I know, Jews for Jesus. And Christ and the Feast of Tabernacles, David Brickner again. And this one is really interesting, Feast of the Lord, because it gets into the Passover and tells you how the Essenes always had their Passover on a Tuesday night. So their first, the Feast of Unleavened Bread with them, as opposed to the Pharisees, was always on a Wednesday. And Pope Benedict XVI mentioned in 2007, hey, Jesus probably kept an Essene Passover. See, you ever wonder how you can keep a Passover one night and be the Passover lamb the next day, when really the next night was supposed to be the Passover? You had 2 Passovers, and I used to think it's because, well, today in modern Judaism you have 2 Passovers outside Israel, but it's for a different reason, which I'll get into. But apparently, and here's what this book says, only women carried water. What did Jesus say? Look for the guy carrying the water. Well, the Essenes had to carry their own water because they never got married. And they weren't just in Qumran, they had communities around the place. So apparently it was an Essene Passover that he kept. And then he kept the regular, he was sacrificed as a regular Passover the next day in preparation for that night. They were sacrificing the lambs. It's supposed to be at night, but actually the temple, they had about 250,000 sacrifices. I've read another, when you get into the Babylonian Talmud and stuff like that, and some other writings that I've actually gone through in my presentations. So here's what the complication you get. You got what the Bible says, the Old Testament, and you got Jewish custom, as the Pharisees were trying to trace things 1,500 years later, and then you got the New Testament application. By the way, you can get on YouTube, I assume it's still there. I get a cousin, and she's very involved in these Jewish things, and she went to the beach in Swampscott, Massachusetts, one of the beaches, Phillips Beach, I believe it was, and tried to get the most amount of people blowing a shofar at the same time. And you can hear her voice in the background. I recognize her voice. Now, I think they're competing in friendly competition with maybe an Australian group, so maybe the record's been broken, but I think at that time it was supposed to be the record. And they got it on YouTube. Anyway, I printed out, not knowing how many people are going to be here, I printed out 9 of these. So I guess it looks like there were 14 of us. Just kind of pass them around, share them, however you want to handle it. To follow along with me, there's so little in the Bible about Rosh Hashanah that I actually am going through just a bit more. But, so it says Rosh Hashanah is really just the beginning of my Feast of the Lord presentation. So you have 7 Feasts of the Lord in Leviticus 23. Well, first of all, it starts out with the Sabbath. Of course, there's also the 7-year Sabbath. There's also the year of Jubilee. I mean, there's a lot in there that you eventually run into. in the Bible. But 3 are found earlier in Exodus 23. Exodus 23 has the 3 pilgrim feasts. Again, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. Leviticus 23 has them in detail, and these 3 pilgrim feasts are mentioned later in Deuteronomy 16. Most of the 7 are mentioned later in Numbers 28 and 29. You always got to try to get everything in the Bible. So remembering that Jewish custom has added a lot to the biblical observances, we see that Leviticus 23 starts out with a weekly Sabbath, that's Shabbat, then goes to Passover.
Nancy.
In the first month, I would have printed out more, it's going to come. 14th day in the evening, and it's Pesach in Hebrew, Leviticus 23:5. Then the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that's the next day. First month, 15 days for 7 days, Leviticus 23:6-8. There's a holy convocation on the first day. Notice I've got in italics, no servile work. Leviticus 23:7 and Numbers 28:18 also. There's a holy convocation on the 7th day, no servile work. Leviticus 23:8, Numbers 28:25, and Deuteronomy 16:8. There are 7 of these no servile works. In other words, extra Sabbaths that don't have to take place on a Saturday. But it's not a 1-for-1 match. It's not 7 holidays, because the Feast of Unleavened Bread has got 2 of them. You still add them up, you get 7. First fruits. Now here's what's confusing. There are 2 first fruits, and they're very different in Hebrew, but they're always, at least in the King James, they're translated first fruits. So the 3rd holiday in Leviticus 23 is first fruits. Of course, the Feast of Unleavened Bread is a pilgrim feast. First fruits, Leviticus 23:10-14, which turns out to be barley. It's Rachit Kitziachem, the first of your harvest. It was the barley harvest. Then Pentecost, Leviticus 23:15-21, which is also first fruits, but a very different Hebrew word, bikurim, and that happened to be wheat. In fact, if you remember, during the plagues, you know, the barley was destroyed, but the wheat wasn't growing up. It gives you some idea of when those particular ones took place. Now, here's the thing. You got Leviticus 23:15 and 16, and actually my Bible's in my case, but you know, I'll get it out of my case. There was some confusion. Remember, at the time of Moses, everyone would have understood all this. By the time the Pharisees came around with what's called Second Commonwealth or Seventh Temple Judaism, there were already some questions. Again, like I keep mentioning, you know, the Bible was written for everybody. It was written to people who understood things that later on we don't understand. And I've mentioned a lot of you earlier, you know, hence 11 Herods in the Bible. 3 of them were called Herod. But everyone back then would have understood all of it, including the scandal that got John the Baptist beheaded. Now, Leviticus 23:15 and 16. So I'm going to go. And here was some confusion, and they had to try to settle it. Leviticus 23:15, and ye shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that ye brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. Even unto the morrow after the 7 Sabbaths shall ye number 50 days, and ye shall offer a new meat offering unto the Lord. And that word meat is actually food, but the Pharisees believed that the Sabbath of Leviticus 23:15 and 16 was the first day of Passover, rather than the weekly Sabbath that falls during the 8 days of Passover, which is what the Sadducees believed. See, the Pharisees and the Sadducees were looking at it differently. The Pharisaic view held out. I mean, when you really look at it in the Bible, you know, it starts talking about counting after the barley. You know, when's the barley harvest? I mean, the people back then would have understood it. By the time the Pharisees and the Sadducees came along, there was already some confusion. And it is more confusing for us, we just don't admit it. No, I'm serious. I keep hearing all these things repeated by people who don't know what you're talking about. It's true. You hear a lot of stuff. We live by bumper stickers. Christianity is not a religion. Can you explain that to James, who told you what true religion is? That's nothing like that in the Bible. No, it's a relationship with Jesus Christ, true, but it's a religion. Part of it is we're so, and I'm actually got a book coming in today which explains some of that. We got so far independent in our thinking as Westerners that we don't even understand what the church is anymore. It's true. A lot of us. Everything's this, yes, I got saved as an individual, but I got saved to become a member of the body of Christ. I didn't get saved to be a lone ranger. But we're so, we live by all these silly bumper stickers. I'm not perfect, just forgive me. Well, no kidding. But a lot of this stuff is just crazy. Of course, people at the time of Moses would have known. Okay? Now, anyway, it's a holy convocation, no servile work in Leviticus 23:21 and Numbers 28:26. The fifth holiday is the Feast of Trumpets, which we're going to talk about today, and it is not called Rosh Hashanah in the Bible. That's a later Jewish addition. It is not the beginning of the new year in the Bible at all. Never was in the Bible. But Jewish tradition has added a lot. By the way, Judaism is based on the teaching of the Pharisees, because the Pharisees wrote the Babylonian Talmud. They were the only ones left after the destruction of Jerusalem. The Sadducees were the temple group. They were probably all wiped out to a man. The Pharisees were more of the party of the common man, and the Sadducees were the elite, the ones who sold out to the Romans. And the Pharisees were scattered amongst different camps in Jerusalem, and a lot of them, I'm sure, were killed. But they were also in synagogues throughout Israel, and a lot of Israel survived that Second Temple destruction. The Essenes were probably wiped out along the way, as were the Zealots, who kept fighting the Romans and finally got themselves killed off. If you read Josephus, the Zealots were very important in the defense of Jerusalem. They were going around doing stupid stuff like burning food so that the Jews had to fight. I actually ran into a modern day zealot on Facebook. These guys are nuts. He said, stoke up the fires at Auschwitz. That's what he said. He said, my family has been in Israel for years. We got along with the Arabs and all these. I guess the Zionists come in and make it hard and everything up. But they were known. Actually, you get into Josephus, it talks about the cannibalism and everything. People cooking their own kids and having to keep the smell away from other people coming in trying to eat. Yeah, and that's prophesied in the Bible. You actually see it in the Bible, in the Old Testament, when they had a siege, and one woman says, we cooked my kid yesterday, I was supposed to cook my buddy's kid today, and she hid the kid. Remember that one? Mm-hmm. But it happened later again. It happens during sieges. But trumpets, Leviticus 23:24-25, in the Bible, Zihon Torah starts a solemn season. It's the 7th month, the first day of the month. There's a Sabbath, this time of the year even says Sabbath, no servile work. Leviticus 23:25, and Numbers 29:1. I just want to talk. Most of these aren't called Sabbaths. Maybe it's Numbers that actually calls it that. I mean, they're considered Sabbaths. Some people argue against it. It's no servile work. Let's see, Numbers 29:1. Okay, it doesn't say. And in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, ye shall have a holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work. It is a day of blowing of trumpets of you. Nothing about a new year, but I'll explain that in a minute. It's very little in the Bible about this day. Now, tradition has been added. The shofar, the ram's horn, is blown 100 times in the synagogue. There are 3 notes. I can remember hearing these. Tekiyah, someone will say Tekiyah, and you hear his particular note. Shevarim and Teruah. Teruah, again, is what you actually see in the Bible. At the end, the Tekiyah Gedolah. Gedolah is feminine for big. The great Tekiyah, a single long drawn out note, the last trumpet it's called. And they'll do this in the synagogue. I've seen them when they blow the shofar. They typically hold something, which isn't often as big as that, but they'll put one finger there. Actually, I can probably blow these. I've marched with a cornet for 7 years in bands. I don't like to tell people in church because then they want me in their church orchestra.
There's another trumpet.
Yeah, I tried that once.
Okay.
Yeah, that's kind of like the mouthpiece I'm used to, B flat cornet. Ancient Jewish tradition, not the Bible, said that on Rosh Hashanah, or Rosh Hashanah we often call it in English, the resurrection would happen. The Bible never calls it Rosh Hashanah, but Yom Teruah, day of shouting. And that's in Numbers 29:1 and Leviticus 23:24. Zicharon Teruah, remembrance shouting. You might have heard of Yom Zikaron, Day of Remembrance in Israel. Zichon is a little bit different. That's actually, they just changed the vowels a bit. It's what they call the strong construct case, which happens a lot in Hebrew. English, we only use it with adjectives, I guess, like the Medes and the Persians, Medo-Persian, Sino-Soviet, Franco-American. You take two adjectives and you change something about the first one. Well, they do it in Hebrew with nouns, and they do it a lot. So Yom HaZikaron becomes Zichon. Yom HaZikaron is remembrance, but remembrance in construct with another noun after it is Zichon. The rabbis named it Rosh Hashanah, New Year, claiming that the Jewish year begins in Tishrei, okay, which is a month. What it is they're trying to go back. They're saying that's when the earth was created. That's the reason it's the New Year, okay? Because according to rabbinical tradition and not the Bible at all, okay, the Bible, the Pharisees, as I mentioned, were the last ones standing and wrote the Babylonian Talmud, and they're the ones that that Babylonian Talmud is what gives you modern Judaism, plus some other stuff that came later, up through around the 15th or maybe up to about the 16th century. With what's called the prepared table, the Shulchan Aruch, which sort of systematized a whole lot of that as far as observances go. The biblical year starts with a month called Nisan or Aviv, okay, Exodus 12:2, which begins a new harvest season. These are two Hebrew names for the same month. Again, you get all this tradition added. But it's the first of the fall holidays, so the rabbis considered it a spiritual new year. Rosh Hashanah designation came more than 1,500 years after the Bible instituted it, at least the 2nd century AD. That or later is when it became Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. Then there's the 10 days of repentance, or 10 of the days of awe, Yom Nohaim, which include Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Actually, the Bible uses the plural, Yom Kippurim, or Yom Kippurim is Day of Atonement, Kippurim being plural, and Yom HaKippurim being Days of Atonement. That's what they're called in the Bible. Yom Kippur, when I was a kid, we called it Yom Kippur. In fact, I know a guy bought a car, he called it Yom Kippur Clipper. What happened is, back in the 60s, they decided, we're going to start pronouncing Hebrew like they do in Israel. This Ashkenazi pronunciation that the East European Jews and the descendants have been praying in isn't quite how they speak in Israel. It's the same language, just a few pronunciation differences. So I remember my grandmother getting upset at that. They call it Yom Kippur. Well, she came from Poland, and that's what they would use during prayer, but they weren't speaking Hebrew in everyday life. In Israel, they use what's called the Sephardic pronunciation, and it's just a few letters pronounced differently, and typically accenting the last syllable more often than not, which makes it hard when you bring the words into English and try to talk. But anyway, in the days in between, during which time, what it is you meditate. It's a solemn time. You try to get right with God, because on Yom Kippur, He's going to put your name in the book of life if you've been good, and maybe not if you've been bad. So you ask forgiveness. Actually, on Yom Kippur, the synagogue gets so crowded, you actually buy seats. You pay, I mean, usually you get annual synagogue dues, but you pay to sit and people show up fasting. You're supposed to fast unless it's bad for your health, or maybe you're pregnant or something. And the Orthodox really just can be there all day. And it's a solemn time, and there are festive Jewish holidays. But this Rosh Hashanah, then the days of awe, and then the Yom Kippur are solemn times. Rosh Hashanah starts on sundown Friday. That would have been last night. After the second temple was destroyed in 70 AD, the Feast of Trumpets was overshadowed by the Jewish New Year. And they weren't blowing trumpets anymore, well, in some synagogues. The beginning of Israel's civil New Year. Now, it's a civil New Year, which really doesn't count for very much. Well, I guess for the holidays, but then again, yeah, I guess they count it for the holidays. You know, modern Israel goes by the same calendar. We got the Gregorian calendar. It's just that the Jewish holidays, they use their luni-solar calendar. They're often mistakenly called a lunar calendar. Lunar calendar is what the Muslims use, and that's why any of their holidays can be at any time of the year. It's actually a lunar calendar. The Jews use a lunar calendar corrected for the solar calendar, so you get leap years. I think it's like 7 every 19 years or something. You add a whole month. But today, you know, anyway, it starts on the first of the month, the new moon. Now, here's the problem is you can't see the new moon very well, okay? And what if it's cloudy and you don't have enough witnesses? So it's not always easy. So to decrease the I'd say change for error, it should be chance for error. Rosh Hashanah was observed for 2 days, even in Israel today. Now, typologically, just maybe, the Feast of the Trumpets is a prophetic type of the judgment. This is what one book claims, okay? What are these books? So I put maybe. Excuse me, I'm getting over being sick. Feast of Trumpets is a prophetic type of the judgment after the second advent at the end of the Great Tribulation, according to one of these books. The 10 days of awe prefigure the millennium of 1,000 years. And Yom Kippur represents the great white throne judgment. That's a prophetic opinion. The Day of Atonement comes after that, Leviticus 23, Yom HaKippurim. In Yom Kippurim, again, they use the plural, I guess, atonements. Actually, atonement, I think, was in neologism. Someone had to make it up. How do you translate this? Kippur really has to do with covering. And atonement means at one man. I think some guy actually had I don't know who it was, I can't remember how to make up the word. When they actually translated Bible in English, they had to deal with things like this. You know, Passover, it's Pesach. So how do you translate that to English? And you know, the angel of death passed over, so they call it Passover. This was another one. But it's a holy convocation, no work, you afflict your souls. Oh, this one, it's a Sabbath of rest. It actually is called a Sabbath. That's, I think, the only one actually I can call the Sabbath. And I got the references there, Leviticus and Numbers. Tabernacles, Hag HaSukkot. Hag means holiday, celebration. Ha is the. In Sukkot, Sukkah is a tabernacle. Sukkot is plural, tabernacles. It's feminine. Most Hebrew feminines end in ot. Some do end in im. In most masculine, which is the majority of nouns, and the plural ends in im and sometimes ot. Like Lila is night, which seems to have a feminine ending, but leilot, that it's actually masculine. That's why you say Lila Tov. And leilot is plural, even though it's masculine. So usually the ot means feminine plural, but not always. But Sukkot is feminine plural, it's tabernacles. If you ever hear Ashkenazi Hebrew, like some really old people, they'll say Sukkos, you know. Or Shavuos for Shavuot, which is weeks, they'll say Shavuos. Probably the Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi Jews like that speak Yiddish as their native language, like Williamsburg, New York, would still say that, but most Jews have gotten away from that. unless they're really old. It's the 7th month for 50, and the 15th day for 7 days. The first date is the Holy Convocation, no servile work. The 8th date is the Holy Convocation, no servile work. It's really interesting that it goes on for 7 days, but they got an 8th day. It's followed today in post-biblical Judaism by a 9th day, what we used to call Simchas Torah, as Simchat Torah, rejoicing in the Lord. In Israel, it's on the 8th day. Like today in Israel, Passover is 1 day or 1 night, but outside Israel, it's 2 nights. So you have 2 Seders in a row. You go to different relatives on different nights. But it marks the conclusion of the annual cycle of public Torah readings. Like you got a new year, but it's, see the Torah, they go through it in a year. And it's what they'll do is for kids in Hebrew school, they pass out little Torahs that are about this big, which you can't reach because the font's so small. But anyway, it is not in the Bible at all. But it does follow that. It does follow Tabernacles. It actually follows the day after Tabernacles. It begins Shemini Atzeret 2023, begins on October 6th this year. Simchat Torah begins the next day on sunset, October 7th, and ends after nightfall on October 8th. Now, the rabbis decided that time differences. Now, here's the thing. Why are some of these holidays 2 days, when it's one in the Bible? Well, you keep running the different explanations. How could you tell when the new moon was? You needed enough witnesses. There was a group in Israel back in the days of the Second Temple trying to mess things up. What they do is they light fires on hilltops to communicate with all the Jews, maybe as far west as Alexandria, Egypt. Yeah, maybe, But certainly the Jews in different cities, because the earth's round. If you light a fire on a hilltop, doesn't mean everyone can see it. So you light a fire, we see the new moon. Someone else would light a fire. I guess they did on Lord of the Rings. I just can't remember that. You light fires in the new moon, and some group was trying to mess it up by lighting fires in the wrong night. Also, how do you know when the new moon is? What if it's cloudy? And here's another one, at least a third explanation. I think I heard another one back in Bible school, or read it. Rabbis decided the time differences, okay, you could have, here you are in Israel, but what if you're on the other side of the globe? It could be 12 hours before, 12 hours after. So for whatever reasons, a lot of these holidays that are in the Bible as 1 day, such as Passover, become 2 days. Okay, but not all of them. So again, you get 7 feasts, 7 days of no work. Although it's not 1 Sabbath per feast. Some, you got 2, and another one you got 0. But anyway, it's just basically an overview of the feasts, plus some added stuff like Simchat Torah, which Jews take kind of seriously. Actually, the 2 biggest festivals, Jews will celebrate Passover more than anything, and probably after that comes Hanukkah, which isn't even in the Bible. Actually, Jesus celebrated it in the New Testament. It's a feast of dedication. What it is apparently the Maccabees cleansed the temple, and they hadn't celebrated Sukkot. So they had a late Sukkot. The story about the oil in the lamp was added centuries later. That's not, you read 1 and 2 Maccabees, you can see what the Maccabees did. Apparently it was a late Sukkot. And Sukkot are probably a late Sukkot. But there's nothing in there about the oil. And we keep mentioning that in Hebrew school and everything when you learn about it, but actually it was added later. Like the bar mitzvah and the bat mitzvah, that came way later. A whole lot of these holidays have just added stuff to them. What's really interesting is Jesus kept, at least referred to things. Okay, here's tabernacles. Tabernacles in the Bible says nothing about water or light. But Jerusalem, according to the Babylonian Talmud, they would light this huge candelabra that would light up all Jerusalem. And they had a water pitcher ceremony. They go to the temple to the pool of Siloam, come back, do that every day for 7 days, but on the 7th day they did it 7 times, kind of like Joshua, going around Jericho. That's not in the Bible. It's not commanded in the Old Testament. And it's not even really mentioned in the New. But here's Jesus on that backdrop talking about being the light of the world in water. On that backdrop. So Jesus used even customs that were not commanded in the Old Testament but were celebrated in the New. Very interesting how that works. And he did go up to Jerusalem at the Feast of Dedication and Festival of Lights, and then John's the one who says that it was the festival of the Feast of Dedication and it was winter. John's was the last gospel written. He's the one who had to start reminding people about these things because they were already getting away from their Jewish roots. He hits the Jews harder than anybody, by the way. It seems to be an anti-Semitic gospel, which it isn't. But as far as the Jewish responsibility for the crucifixion, John likes him more than the other gospel writers. By that time, the church was predominantly Gentile. And he's also the one that says, as far as Passover, it should be John 19:30. The gospel writer that says, let's see, John 19:30, that Passover was a high. Let's see, John 19:30. No, not 19:30.
What are you looking up? About Feast of Dedication?
No, not the Feast of Dedication. That it was a particular Passover, and it was a high day the next day. No, it was 19 something. I think. And it was the preparation of Passover. Let's see, John 9. I keep saying it's 30.
1931.
31, not bad, one verse off. The Jews, therefore, because there was the preparation that the body should not remain upon the cross on the Sabbath day, for that Sabbath day was an high day. See, the earlier Gospels would have been written to people who knew that Sabbath was a high day. John's writing later. He has to tell you that. Okay? That's a clue about where people were at. He had to say it was a high day. The earlier people would have known that. It wasn't a Saturday Sabbath. It was it was one of these 7 Sabbaths in Leviticus 23 that don't have to occur on a Saturday. So that's apparently what's going on. And some of this stuff came out, I think, with the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes and who they are and what they did. And so this is like 20th century stuff, 21st century stuff, as we're finally putting it together. Yeah, I like that picture of, well, someday I'll see it. What used to be called the Semitic Museum, it's now the Harvard Museum of Ancient Near East History. They renamed it because Semitic has come to mean Jewish because of the term anti-Semitic, which was termed by a guy who hated Jews, a German guy, Wilhelm Marr. He didn't want to make it look like we Germans, this is the 19th century too, like we Europeans aren't against Jewish religion, we're against the race, I guess it was. And so he came up with the term anti-Semitic. Semitic was simply a family of languages.